In terms of what's going to happen on August 22nd, I mean, it's not like I broke into a safe in the Kremlin and stole this information. It's out there, but you have to know how to look. You have to know where to look, and you have to know how to analyze it. And again, you have to just get out of your American mindset and
Hmm.
think about this from their perspective, or you won't get it. Um, but so the meeting's in Johannesburg. It's locations flipped around, but they've ended up in Johannesburg. Technically, a place called Sandton, which is Johannesburg is so crime ridden. They built another city right next to it that's pretty clean, so they call it Sandton. That's where the conference is going to be. This is the Leaders Summit. I mentioned they have 100 or more mini summits all over the world. This is the Leaders Summit. So Ramaphosa of South Africa, Lula da Silva, Brazil, Prime Minister Modi of India, and Xi Jinping of China are going to be there. Now, Putin was supposed to be there, but here it gets complicated. There's an outstanding warrant for Putin's arrest issued by the International Criminal Court on, so-called war crimes. I think we could issue a few of those, but it's kind of under the thumb of the U.S. South Africa is a member of the International Criminal Court. There's a treaty and they signed it. So everyone's like, well, arrest Putin when he gets off the plane. And President Ramaphosa said, no, we're not going to do that. And he called the Kremlin and said, rest assured, we're not going to arrest you. But the opposition party in South Africa filed a petition with the Supreme Court to get an arrest warrant. Plus, you have to worry about NGOs and third parties and other people who might take it upon themselves. So Putin, I think very wisely said, this is a distraction. We don't need this right now. So he's going to stay in Moscow and he'll participate by Zoom. And a lot of people go, well, there goes the BRICS summit. I think the opposite is true. This is going to, first of all, infuriate the rest of them, and it's going to make them more determined, because this is an example of Western hegemony. This is an example of hegemonic bullying. Again, I don't need to take sides on the politics. I'm just telling you what's going on. And so the fact that Putin's got to sit in the Kremlin and zoom in is another example of Western bullying, for want of a better word. But they're going to go ahead with it. Number one, and Sergei Lavrov, who's the foreign minister, will be, and I think he's the brains behind this. And I'm not, here's what I'm not saying. I'm not saying we're all going to go to bed on the 22nd of August and we're going to wake up on the 23rd and there's a new currency and the dollar's down. No, that's not happening. They're going to announce it. It will be introduced in stages. It will take a while to, but the big thing is the thing I mentioned, which is the definition will be by weight of gold. Now, by the way, and I don't want to take too much time on this, this process is an exact duplication of the process that John Maynard Keynes went through at Bretton Woods. And he was ultimately unsuccessful. He was overruled by the United States and Harry Dexter White, who was the US delegate, who turned out to be a Stalinist agent. We found that out later. But what Keynes wanted, and I'm sure you know this, he wanted world money. He wanted the Bancor. He didn't like the idea. He wasn't against gold, not at all. But he was against the idea that somehow only the dollar would be tied to gold and everybody else would be tied to the dollar. That meant you had to go to the US and via the IMF and say, Mother, may I, devalue or whatever, because the US was in charge. Keynes said, let's have one currency unit, a world money. He called it the Bancor. And the other thing he did, when he started, I've read all his papers, he started his research with a commodity basket. I said, well, all right, so what's a Bancor worth? Same problem the BRICS are facing. What's a Bancor worth? He said, well, you could have so many barrels of oil, so many bushels of wheat, so many tons of copper, et cetera, through this commodity basket. And he very quickly discovered that commodities are not quite as generic or homogeneous as people believe. They're oil, yeah, but there's 72 grades of oil around the world based on sulfur content, viscosity, transportation costs. They're not all the same. So through a process of elimination, he just said, well, why don't we just use gold? And gold's easy. It's not that it's pretty and shiny, but it's an element. It's not even a molecule. It's an atomic number 79. And it serves the same purpose, which is it gives you an anchor. And anyway, that was rejected. About 6 months ago, maybe a little bit longer, maybe late last year, I remember reading about the BRICS deliberations on exactly what we were talking about. And maybe it's as far ago as a year ago, as long ago as a year, but they were talking about a commodity basket. oil, wheat, copper, all this stuff. And I just said, I kind of laughed. I said,
They'll never work.
they're going to end up with gold. They're repeating Keynes' process, and they're going to have the same result, which is they're going to find it's not really feasible, and they're going to end up with gold. And sure enough, they have. But the extent to which this is very much based on John Maynard Keynes, what Keynes wanted to do, not where we ended up, not the Bretton Woods deal, but the Keynes deal with the world money tied to gold. That's what they're doing. Is the Fed the ultimate buyer of last resort of treasuries? Yes. But there's an intermediate buyer, which is the US banking system. In the 1950s, a typical large US bank balance sheet was 40% treasuries. That was normal. That wasn't like hoarding. Today, it's about 5 to 7%. So I think you'll get a phone call to Jamie Dimon and all the other CEOs, Jane Meyer and the lady at Citi. They'll call them first and say, people got to buy bonds. And of course, they're all under the thumb of the US government, and they will. So you might have a pretty good cushion of bond buyers before you have to turn to the Fed and expand the Fed balance sheet. Now, so you do have a large pool of intermediate buyers before you get to the Fed. It doesn't really solve the problem. It just passes it around the banking system. By the way, the Chinese are doing something very similar right now. Everyone's like, why hasn't the People's Bank of China sold more dollars? Well, it's because they're making the banks do it. The commercial banks are selling the dollars and propping up the yuan. And we can see something similar in the United States. So that's one. I just kind of pencil in the commercial banking system, at least the big banks, as potential buyers of not quite last resort, as a way to put it. But the other thing, the BRICS, what they've done, this is part of the brilliance, they've opted out of the exchange market. They're like, because normally if the dollar is getting weaker, you're getting stronger. That's bad for exports. It's bad for export-related jobs, et cetera. And it's currency wars. That was my first book, Currency Wars. But by defining their currency by weight of gold, not dollar amount, but by weight of gold, they're out of the foreign exchange market. They can just sit back and watch the show. It's very hard to tease information out, particularly the Russians. About 10 days ago, there was a big headline. South African, they call them Sherpas, but delegate to the BRICS meeting, not President Ramaphosa, but just some mid-level bureaucrat, whatever. Says new currency not on the agenda. New currency not on the agenda, blah, blah, blah. Well, I'm sorry. Sergei Lavrov said it is. Now, Sergei Lavrov is the greatest, smartest, most powerful diplomat in the world. He's the foreign minister of Russia. I wish I could say something similar about the US team, but I can't. We got Jake Sullivan's a political hack. Tony Blinken's a lightweight. Victoria Nuland's a bloodthirsty warmonger. I mean, we just have, she's got like an undergraduate degree. Okay, okay school, but what kind of training is that for? I was in the Pentagon, this was a few years ago, but it was like what they call a tabletop war game. So about 15 experts sitting around doing scenarios. And I was sitting one seat away from a guy. He was US Treasury financial delegate to Asia. So kind of ambassador at large for the dollar. And his name was David Dollar. So it's kind of a nice twist. But so I said, and I always tell people, I'm in the Pentagon. I tell them what I'm telling you and your audience. Like, I don't, And I said, and this is back when the Iranian sanctions were a big deal. This is before Ukraine and before Russia. Mm-hmm. I said, this stuff works to an extent. It's not perfect, but it does work. And we did drive Iran to the bargaining table for the JCPOA in 2015. So I'm not saying it's completely ineffective. I said, but you guys are you're weaponizing the dollar. You're taking it too far, and you're going to get a backlash. How many times can you punch the punching bag before the punching bag gets up and walks out of the room? That's what you're facing. I told him this, like I say, 7, 8 years ago. And David Dollar takes his hands, he takes both hands and slams them on the table, palm down, boom. And he goes, the US dollar has been the global reserve currency. It is the global reserve currency, and it will always be the global reserve currency. Exact quote. And I said, David, I feel like I'm in Whitehall in 1913 listening to John Bowles say, sterling is the global reserve currency and it always will be, et cetera. I said, you're blind, but hubris is a good word. In plain English, taking it for granted. I mean, if you take your status for granted, then you can do all kinds of crazy stuff and not worry about it. But you can't take your status for granted. You have to earn it every day, and through we got the trust. We started with the trust, earned, like I say, since 1791, but we blew it. And I've always said, and I told government officials this. I said, I don't really think our adversaries can destroy the dollar, but I think we can do it ourselves. And I would have said, and I have said, in discussing could China be the global reserve currency, whatever. And I don't have to repeat it, but I went down all the elements and mechanics of and hedging of a bond market big enough to be to absorb global savings, and the Treasury has that. And I say China's not even close. China's not going to be global reserve currency, or I don't know, maybe never. They don't have any of those things. They don't have primary dealers. They don't have auctions. They don't have a large bond market. They don't have a rule of law. Neither does Russia. Who trusts the Russians? But then in thinking about the BRICS currency, I had another one of these like aha moments, like where a light bulb goes on. I said, oh, I was writing or something, doing some research on World War I. Basically the history of government finance of war is what I was looking at. And I saw this Liberty bond poster, and it was, Lady Liberty, Statue of Liberty with a torch. And she, instead of the tablet, she had like a Liberty bond. And she was like, come on, America, we got to win the war, buy Liberty bonds. And in my book, The New Great Depression, which came out in 2021, was half the book was about the pandemic. Half was inflation, deflation, but the other half was the pandemic. And one of the issues that came up, because I said, well, it's kind of a new pandemic, why don't I read about the old one? And I read like 4 or 5 books on the Spanish flu of 1918. And one of the vignettes was they didn't know until 1930 what caused the Spanish flu. They didn't know what a virus was really until the electron microscope. But they had a sense that it spread around. And so in Philadelphia, in 1917, there was going to be this big parade to buy Liberty bonds. It was like a freedom, win the war pep rally. And all these doctors from the University of Pennsylvania and elsewhere were like, don't do this. You're going to get 100,000 people on Broad Street, and they're all going to die of the Spanish flu, in effect. And they went ahead anyway. They did it because, for 2 reasons. One, that's how important it was. But 2, there was more extreme censorship under Woodrow Wilson than there is today under Biden. I know that sounds like can't be true, but it was. They were arresting people. You couldn't write a newspaper article about the Spanish flu because it was considered bad for morale in terms of the war. And in fact, the reason it's called the Spanish flu is that Spain was not in World War I. They were not a belligerent. So their newspapers like, hey, we got this flu, and they were writing all about it. And the rest of the world's like, hey, I read the Spanish newspaper said they got a flu. So they called it the Spanish flu, even though Spain had nothing to do with it, but they were the only country that was allowed to talk about it. So, but what that did, if you look at the history of, these are some old names, I'm just, been around a while, E.F. Hutton, Dean Witter, Merrill Lynch, when were these firms founded? It was around 1910, 1912, 1914, and a little bit later in some cases. But the Liberty bond was the beginning of the retail investing market in the United States. Prior to World War I, U.S. wars were always financed by big shots. Stephen Girard financed the War of 1812. Nicholas Biddle financed the Revolutionary War. James Cook financed the Civil War. There these dealers who did it, but that all changed around World War I. So my point being, there's an example, contrary to everything I just said about China building a top-down bond market, and I don't think they can do it. Here's an example of a bottom-up bond market, where you basically got retail investors to buy into these bonds, and if you get enough of them, you're going to have a bond market because somebody will start making a market in it. And let's say you go to a typical Brazilian, and you say, hey, you got 2 choices. You can buy a Raiz-denominated bond, or you can buy a BRICS-denominated bond. What do you want?
What do you think?
And then multiply that by the world. So that's not going to happen overnight by any means.